Good afternoon. Shall we start? Are you with me? Shall we start? Good afternoon, all of you. Okay. So I think we can start. Last week, in fact, we were dealing with MED008 block 1. Today we shall go into MED008 block 2. And this is basically a section that deals with international summits and declarations. So we will be talking a lot about the major international summits, declarations, etc., which are associated with environmental issues. And I am sure that you will come to know a lot of aspects regarding all this. And further, there will be many aspects that you already know. So where you do know those aspects, it will be a kind of revision for you. And where you are unaware of those things, it will be an occasion to actually study and understand new aspects about international summits and declarations. Now, when we talk about this concept of international summits, declarations, etc., there are three concepts which are very important. One is the concept of treaties, the second is the concept of protocols, and the third is the concept of declarations. Now, there is a subtle difference between all these three. These are not the same. Now, when we talk about treaties, treaties are basically binding formal agreements which establish the rights and obligations of two or more subjects under international law. Now, what are the subjects under international law? One of the subjects under international law can be a state. State is one of the subjects. Then international organizations can be, in fact, subjects under international law. Then international non-governmental agencies can be subjects under international law. So you have various subjects under international law, and a treaty is in fact a formal agreement or a contract, and it is written. That is the important thing. A treaty is always written. It's not verbal. So treaty is a formal agreement, contract, and other written instruments that establish the right and obligations of the subjects or parties under international law. Now then, what are protocols? Protocols basically provide the procedures for adoption of detailed obligations. Now, if you want to put something into a treaty, there are certain protocols or procedures associated with that. And those procedures are basically called the protocol. So, on the one hand, you have the Convention of Climate Change, which is basically a treaty. Now, when you talk about the Convention of Climate Change, on the other hand, you should understand that behind the Convention on Climate Change, there are a number of protocols, and one of those protocols is the Kyoto Protocol. So the Kyoto Protocol basically brings in many aspects into the Convention of Climate Change. Now, declarations are the third aspect. Declarations are basically principles, statements, or rules which are not binding as treaties but contribute in the creation of an appropriate environment for negotiation. So declarations are basically principles. You should understand that declarations are just principles. They are not treaties, they are not protocols, but they are stated principles. For example, you have a number of declarations in recent times, like the Bali Declaration. Bali Declaration is basically something that deals with enunciation of certain principles related to climate change. So these declarations are only principles, statements, or rules. They are nothing more than that. And therefore, they do not have the power of a treaty. Whereas the treaty is a formally agreed agreement between two parties of international law. So this distinction you should clearly understand. Now, there is a clear history of environmental negotiation. For example, if you look at the history of environmental negotiations, you will find that initially environmental negotiations resulted as a effort of scientists and individuals of US and the European countries. They wanted certain principles in certain areas like animal protection and so on. So they got together, these private individuals got together, and they brought out certain principles. So that was how these principles of environmental negotiation actually started. Now, these developments were based on the growing awareness that international summits and declarations are very, very important, because at that time there was a huge decrease in forest cover, there was exploitation of natural resources, so on and so forth. So these experts understood that all nations and people should come together to form agreements, treaties, etc. So the early rules, in fact, acknowledged the sovereignty of nation states. That is, they understood that nation states or countries are the final authority which deals with environment and related aspects. So they stated very clearly that the state should be involved as a party. Then only these negotiations will be successful. Now, before the formation of the United Nations, we all know that United Nations is the primary agency which deals with the welfare of mankind. So before the UN itself, there were several treaties and laws. For example, in 1872, Switzerland, in fact, came up with an international regulatory commission for the protection of birds. And this proposal later on found itself as the International Ornithological Committee of 1884. Similarly, in 1916, you had a treaty for the dealing with the protection of migratory birds in the US. And later on, Canada and Great Britain also joined the US to be parties of this treaty. So similarly, you have a number of treaties and declarations before the UN actually came into existence. Now, one of the most important treaties or the commission that you should take note of is the World Commission on Environment and Development, that is the WD. Now, in the examinations also, it is very popular to ask a question from this area. So, the World Commission on Environment and Development is a significant area that you should all understand. Now, this commission was chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland. She was the Norwegian Prime Minister, and she was the chairman of this commission. And this commission is also known by the name Brundtland Commission, and this brought out a report which was titled as Our Common Future. Now, you should all remember this term, Our Common Future, because the Brundtland Commission is alternatively known as the Our Common Future Commission as well. And this is the name of the document that they brought out. Now, why is this document, Our Common Future, very important? Because it brought in the concept of sustainable development in a big way. We all know what sustainable development is, isn't it? All of you must be aware of the concept of sustainable development, aren't you? Can anyone state what is sustainable development? What is sustain? You can unmute and tell me. Okay. I hope all of you are with me. Anyway, sustainable development is that development which meets the need of the present generation without compromising on the ability of the future generations to meet their needs. This is very important. Now, what is happening all around us? You can see the degradation of the forests in Kerala, or for that matter in India. Do they meet the criteria of sustainable development? Obviously not, because this is not the development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of the future to meet their needs. Now, what will happen if we go on this path of development that we have today? Soon the earth will become uninhabitable. So that's why the WCED was very clear that when we go in for development, it should always be sustainable development. So the report emphasized that the essential needs of the world's poor should be given priority. Now, one of the important aspects that we should understand is many of the problems associated with environmental degradation come up because most of the people are poor. Now, if you are poor and if you do not have a sustainable way of life, then you will be depending on forest produce, you will be depending on wood for your energy needs, and you will be cutting down trees and such other things. So obviously, your environment is going to suffer in this process. So it is therefore important that the WCAD brought out this concept of polluter pays principle. Now, what is polluter pays principle? It simply means that those who cause pollution should pay for the removal of the pollution that they have caused. So, if you have put poison into a lake, then you should be the person who should be removing that poison, meeting all the costs which are involved. Now, another important convention, not another important, it is one of the most important convention related to biodiversity is the Convention on Biodiversity. Now, you can go to this link when I pass on this PPT at the end of my 4 sessions. You can go to the link which is given here. So, I have made a video here which deals with the Convention of Biodiversity, and it will be very useful for you. It will give you a very clear idea of what the Convention of Biodiversity is all about. Now, this Convention of Biodiversity was basically adopted under the Rio Summit. Now, the final text of the Convention of Biodiversity states 3 principles. One is that biodiversity has to be conserved. Second, it has to be sustainably used. That's very important. It has to be sustainably used. And the third one is that it should be fairly and equitably shared. The benefits of biodiversity should be fairly and equitably shared. Now, as we all know, many industrialized countries take the biodiversity of developing countries and develop their own products. But the benefit is not given back to the developing countries. So, this CBD wanted that this the benefits which arise out of the use of biodiversity and its products should be returned back to the communities which actually used it. Now, Article 10 of the convention is very important. It states that parties shall integrate considerations of conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity into national decision making. The second point was that parties shall adopt measures related to the use of biological resources to avoid or minimize adverse impacts on biodiversity. It also called for local support of the local populations to develop and implement remedial actions in degraded areas where biodiversity has been reduced. And it also asks for cooperation between governmental authorities and private and public sector to strengthen the sustainable use of biological resources. So it is a very important convention, and this is a convention that you should all be aware about, the Convention on Biodiversity, or the CBD. Now, this is a very important aspect. CBD, in the CBD, there is this concept of farmers versus breeders' right. Now, you all know that many industrialized countries and their multinational companies, in fact, produce seeds. And these seeds are basically those where the germplasm has been taken away from the local communities from across the world, and they have been developed in a different fashion. Now, the US felt that the Convention on Biodiversity was not there in their interest, and they said that the concept was against intellectual property rights. What does intellectual property rights say? Intellectual property rights says that whatever has been produced as a result of my intellect shall be my property. However, in the case of Convention on Biodiversity, they say that it's not like that. You are taking the germplasm or biodiversity of developing countries and you are building upon it a new product. And therefore, this intellectual property is not entirely yours. You are supposed to, whatever you have developed as a new product, the benefit of that should be shared along with the local communities from where this product actually emerged. So several industrialist countries have so far refused to be a part of the international undertaking on plant genetic resources. So that is another convention. It is an undertaking that the benefits of the use of plant genetic resources shall be equally distributed among all parties concerned. And it also called for the free flow of germplasm. That is, if you use the germplasm of a particular local resource, then the benefit from that should go to that local community which developed or which preserved that germplasm for centuries. For example, in Kerala, you have the example of Arogya Pacha. You must have all heard that. It is a small medicinal herb, and the product of that medicinal herb can be used for various medical uses, and it is a major product as far as Ayurveda is concerned. Now, this particular herb has been sustained by a tribe called the Kani tribe. And what the Kani tribe has done is that they have, in fact, protected this resource. And when a company wanted to utilize this resource, that is this Arogya Pacha for industrial use, the government stated that you can definitely use it. There is absolutely no problem. But the benefit that you get out of this, the use of this particular product, when you prepare it in an industrial manner, that has to be, in fact, shared with the community which actually developed it, that is the Kani tribe. So that is the way in which the Convention on Biological Diversity actually works. Now, the problem with many industrialized countries and MNCs is that they take the germplasm from developing countries and develop their own products based on that germplasm. But they do not return the benefit that has been derived from them by making it commercially available. And this is a major problem. Now, that is why there is a conflict between the traditional rights and the trade-related intellectual property rights, or the TRIPS. Now, if you look at TRIPS, what is it? Basically, it deals with trade associated with the intellectual property rights. Intellectual property rights is basically your thoughts, ideas, information, and anything that is a product of your intellect or your intelligence. Now, there are basically two categories of intellectual property rights under the TRIPS regime. One is the copyright and related rights, which is basically which basically deals with literary and artistic works. And the second one is more important, that is industrial property. This includes the protection of distinctive signs like trademarks or geographic indications or industrial property, so on and so forth. Design, technology, industrial circuits, all these are protected under industrial property protection. Now, TRIPS basically depends on the concept of might is right. That is, whoever is powerful, they can utilize the intellectual property and get it protected. However, the problem is when it comes to biopiracy. Biopiracy is basically the stealing of culturally and communally held resources and knowledge with local communities. For example, neem or turmeric for that matter, that has been used for centuries by Indians. Now, one fine day, what happened was that one of these gentlemen who was working in a multinational company, they just took away this neem and some of its medicinal properties, and he just went ahead and patented it. Now, what is the result of that? If that patent had been accepted, even Indians who use that neem or that turmeric for medicinal purposes, they would have had to pay a kind of royalty to this particular industry to utilize that. So that was prevented by the government of India intervening successfully and reversing that patent. So when you have to, in fact, prevent a patent from taking place, you have to show prior art. That is, you have to show that the product is already being used. And for that, you need proper documentation. And that is what most of the developing countries actually lack. So we come to another important area, that is the important area of genetically modified organisms. Now, using the genetic material of many species, the industries manipulate them and modify them into a new product. Now when they modify into a new product, these industries claim that the complete property that is created newly is their own. Now, there are a number of ethical issues related to genetically modified products because we never know what is the impact of a genetically modified organism on the environment because it is new to that environment. For example, if you prepare a genetically modified rat, we can never say what will be the impact of that rat on other rats or humans even. The rat may in fact be poisonous and its bite can in fact kill people. So you can never say what will be the impact of that genetically modified rat on the environment. So that is why genetically modified organisms are such a major concern for all people across the world. So that's why we have something called the Cartagena Protocol on Biosafety. Now, what does this protocol deal with? The objective of this protocol is to contribute to ensuring an adequate level of protection in the field of safe transfer, handling, and use of genetically modified organisms. So, this protocol basically deals with three aspects. One is safe transfer, handling, and use of genetically modified organisms. Because this is very important when we talk about transfer, it is not only within the sorry, there was some network disruption. I think we can start now. I'm sorry for the disruption from the network point of view. Kindly give me a moment so that I can load the presentation again. So, till now, I hope the slide is visible. Okay. Till now, we were dealing with the aspects of CBD, Convention on Biodiversity. We dealt with genetically modified organisms and so on. Now, we will deal with the very important area of Global Environment Facility or GEF. This is very, very important. Now, what does the GEF deal with? The Global Environment Facility is basically a pilot program under which grants or concessional loans are provided to developing countries to help them implement programs that protect the global environment. Now, there are four areas which have been identified under the GEF or the Global Environment Facility. One is protection of the ozone layer. We all know that that's a major area of concern and it needs to be protected. Second is limiting emissions of greenhouse gases. Third is the area of biodiversity protection. And fourth is the area of environmental protection related to international waters. So there are 4 areas which are dealt with under the Global Environment Facility, and it is, as I mentioned earlier, a pilot program under which grants and concessional loans are given to various countries so that they protect the environment effectively. Now, there are certain principles associated with environment law, and these are very important. One is the principle of state responsibility. Now, we all know that states are the primary actors under international law. And now, if the state is held responsible, then it has far-reaching repercussions. Now, every state is responsible if the wrongful act or omission has resulted in breach of international obligations. If an act by a state has breached international obligation, then the state is responsible for that act and it can be penalized. Then the state is also responsible for the act committed by its agents. If within a state, certain industries or its citizens or its diplomats, in fact, do anything contrary to international law, then the state is responsible for that. It is also liable for any wrong that is done by any private individual within the state. And the state did not exercise due diligence to prevent this damage. Now, often what happens is that some private individual may do something which harms other states as well. And if the state is not taking any measure to prevent that, then the state is liable for international sanction. That is why when we say that certain countries harbor terrorists, it is the obligation of that state not to let those terrorists enter other states, because you have an international obligation to maintain peace and tranquility across the board. So you cannot say that these actors are acting within my state, but I have no control. If the actors are acting within your state, then definitely you should have control over those actors as well. The second principle is also a very important principle, and this principle is the principle of good neighborliness or cooperation. And the implication of this principle is that the state has to use its property in such a manner that its actions do not injure or harm the property or legal interests of another state. So, whatever one state does, it should not have a negative impact on any other state. So, there is a very famous case related to this principle, and this case is a trail smelter case. And this was between Canada and USA. What happened was that some smelting operations were initiated in the Canadian territories by some of its citizens, and as a result of that, the smoke and other things just emitted out of the smelting entered the US territory, and as a result, the property of some US citizens was damaged. So the International Court of Justice held that Canada was in fact responsible for violating the principle of good neighborliness. So that definitely means that there should be cooperation to solve environmental issues which have a transboundary nature. Then the third principle is the principle of sustainable development, which was brought up mainly as principle 3 of the Rio Declaration. And this this declaration states that our development should be of such a nature that not only our needs, but the needs of the future generation also should be taken into consideration. And that was what we mentioned earlier. So here what we mean is that there should be a balance between the ecological concerns and economic concerns. So you should not concentrate too much on the economic concerns in a nature that there will be nothing left for the future generations to build their lives on. So environment protection and economic development have to be complementary according to this principle. Then another important principle is the principle of polluter pays. This simply means that whoever causes pollution has to pay for that. That is, if a person or an individual or a country in fact pays, pollutes a certain area, then that country is liable to in fact remove that pollution. And there have been a number of cases in this regard. One was the Sriram Food and Fertilizer case, which is an Indian case. In this case, what happened was that Sriram Food and Fertilizers, a company in Delhi, in fact, emitted a noxious gas, oleum gas, and because of which many people were injured and some were killed in that process. And over a period of time, what happened was that it caused a major environmental problem. So the court said that this particular industry, that is Sriram Food and Fertilizers, was definitely liable to, in fact, clean the environment and also compensate people who are affected by the oleum gas leak. And in this particular case, the concept of absolute advantage, absolute liability was in fact brought out by the Delhi High Court. Then the next principle is the principle of precaution. Now, in many cases, you may not be having exact scientific evidence that a particular activity results in a certain environmental damage. But there may be a reasonable apprehension that a certain activity may cause environmental damage. In that case, what this principle actually suggests is that we should be careful in dealing with such cases, and where there is scientific uncertainty, the principle of prevention is better than use should be better than cure should be applied. And if there is a scientific concern but no substantial evidence is there, even then that particular activity should be avoided. So that is the principle of precaution. And we have very many examples in this case. For example, we have all heard about mobile towers. There is no practical evidence of a major scientific nature that mobile towers actually cause harm to species all around it. However, there is an apprehension and a certain degree of fear that it may actually do so. And because of that, this principle of precaution has been applied, and therefore at many places mobile towers are not allowed. Then there is this concept of intergenerational equity, which basically means that you have to sustain the environment for future generations. Now, in the Philippines, there was a case in which the government had in fact allowed deforestation for a certain purpose. Now, 44 minor environmental organizations challenged this, and they said that we have to protect this forest for future generations. The court agreed to this concept and said that yes, the unborn future generations also have their own rights, and therefore we cannot just cut down the forest. Then there is another principle, the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, which basically means that all countries are not equal. Now, the developing countries have developed only for a few years, whereas the developed countries have been developing for more than 200 years. The developed countries have over time used the resources of the developing countries, and they have developed to a great deal of extent. So what it means is that when it comes to environmental obligations, it cannot be equal. The developed countries have to take a major share of environmental protection when compared to developing countries, and the kind of pressure that has to be put on developing countries has to be much lesser, because they still have a long way to go to attain development. So what it means basically is that when it comes to the third world countries, that is developing countries, they have in fact been the countries which have suffered due to the development processes of the developed countries or the northern countries. Now, the big countries, the developed countries of the world like US and European countries, they have in fact been colonists. That is, they have colonized the countries of Asia, South Asia, etc., and degraded their resources. And therefore, the developing countries today face poverty and such other problems due to this kind of degradation. So what it means is that developing countries should be given assistance and help to reach the level of development of developed countries, and the environmental obligations of the developing countries should be much lesser than the developed countries. Now, as far as the international obligations are concerned, the international environmental agreements are concerned, you have a number of international environmental agreements. For example, we can start with the Ramsar Convention. This is a convention which deals with the use of wetlands. That is, it states that wetlands should be preserved and the biodiversity of wetlands should also be preserved as well. Similarly, you have the World Heritage Convention of 1972, which states that World Heritage sites, which are important for conservation, they should be protected for future generations. Then you have the law called international convention called the London Dumping Convention, which states that the waste that is being dumped into the sea should be controlled. Then you have the Marpol Convention. This is very important. The Marpol basically means marine pollution. It deals with ways and means to reduce marine pollution by reducing the discharges from ships which are on the sea into the sea. Now, what happens is that when the ships move into the sea, they often discharge huge amounts of waste into the sea. So, the Marpol Convention of 73 and 78 want to limit this waste generation and disposal. Then you have a very important convention, the CITES Convention, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, which seeks to protect many species like rhino, tiger, panda, etc., which are becoming extinct. Then another important convention is the Law of the Sea Convention of 1982, which seeks to control marine pollution and the fragile coastal ecosystem. Similarly, you have the Basel Convention. Basel Convention deals with controlling the transboundary movement of hazardous waste. Because very often we see that the hazardous waste are often dumped in developing countries. So this was sought to be limited by the Basel Convention. So the Basel Convention stated that unless and until the countries themselves allow the waste to be dumped into their countries, you cannot so moto send this waste to another country. Then Agenda 21, which was a part of the Rio Summit, also dealt with a lot of areas related to human health, conservation, management, so on and so forth. Similarly, you have the Climate Change Convention of 92, where it was said that a change of climate is attributed to human activity that alters the composition of global atmosphere and which is in addition to natural climate vulnerability. So climate change convention was also very important and it sought to limit the emission of greenhouse gases, and that's why this climate change convention was very, very important, because greenhouse gases, as we know, is a major problem, and this climate change convention tried to limit this this emission. Then you have the Convention on Biological Diversity, which we have discussed earlier in great detail. Then we all know that the UN agencies, the United Nations agencies, also have a major role to play in environmental protection. As we all know, the UN was formed on 24th October 1945. The term of the UN, the term UN was in fact coined by the US President Franklin Roosevelt. At present, 191 countries are basically part of the United Nations. And this UN is based on the principle of equality of all nations. That is, all nations are equal. Now, this is something that you need not know in great detail, but UN has many units of its own, or it has a specific structure. It has the General Assembly in which all 191 members are represented, and each member has one vote. Then it has Security Council in which there are 15 members, and of which 5 members have veto power. These are China, France, Russia, United Kingdom, and the United States. Then it has the Economic and Social Council, which has 54 members. And Economic and Social Council is very important as far as environment protection is concerned. And it was the ECOSOC, which in fact created the Commission on Sustainable Development. Then you have the UN Secretariat, which is headed by the Secretary General, and you have the International Court of Justice, which acts as the justice dispensing unit of the UN. And as far as the UN's environmental agenda is concerned, it is basically dealt with under Article 55 of the Charter. And it aims at improving the standards of living of people, promoting social progress, and also providing solutions to health and health-related problems. Under Article 22, the General Assembly can and has established a number of agencies. These include the Food and Agriculture Organization, then Economic and Social Council has in fact passed a resolution to convene a UN conference on conservation and utilization of resources. And further, in the year 1958, we had the High Seas Fishing Convention, in which fish stocks were supposed to be protected. 1971, we have already seen that there was the Ramsar Convention on the wetlands. And in 1968, we had the African Nature Convention. And also in 72, we had what is known as the Oslo Dumping Convention, where hazardous waste was prevented from being dumped into developing countries. The UN Conference on Human Environment is very important because it brought the developed and developing countries together in the activity of protecting environment for the first time. So, an action plan of 109 recommendations were initiated, and the UN agencies and international organizations were asked to cooperate with each other in the areas of human settlement, natural resource management, pollution control, etc. The one of the important highlights of the UNCHE was the creation of the UNEP, or the UN Environment Program. And today, UN Environment Program is at the forefront of environment protection policy making in the UN. Then in the UN, we also have the Environmental Coordination Board, which is formed as an inter-secretariat body and was made under the chairmanship of the UNEP Executive Director. Now, we have seen in a small detail this World Commission on Environment and Development. So, this was basically the Brundtland Commission report, which was published in 1987, about which we have seen a bit earlier. Now, there is a specific role for UN agencies. And the Earth Summit of 1992 was at the forefront of presenting this role. This Earth Summit of 1992 presented the Agenda 21. That is the agenda for the year 2021. And in this Agenda 2021, there were 40 chapters which address various topics like toxic chemicals, radioactive waste, biodiversity, biological conservation, sustainable agriculture, etc. The UN also created the UN Commission for Sustainable Development, and it was aimed at monitoring the national initiatives for the achievement of the various points which were presented under Agenda 21, and also to look into follow-up actions to achieving the goals of Agenda 21, including that of technology transfer to developing countries. Technology transfer is very important. If you see, developing countries cannot protect the environment to the same extent as developed countries because of the lack of technology also. So if you have to effectively protect the environment, then the technologies developed by the developed countries have to be transferred on to the developing countries also. Now, there was a World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. This was held in Johannesburg. Now, the major goal of this summit was to establish a dialogue between government, civil society, and private sector. So this summit basically was very unhappy with the development, with the progress in implementing sustainable development since the 1992 Earth Summit. They said that much progress has not taken place in this regard, and therefore we need to act very, very positively. So they had the targets such as providing basic sanitation by 2015 to all people, providing, in fact, removing all kinds of chemicals which have an adverse impact on health and environment, restoring fish stocks, and reducing loss of biodiversity, etc. But much of this has not happened till date. Now we come to an important area, that is the Bretton Woods institutions. Now, what are these Bretton Woods institutions? Bretton Woods institutions are basically the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Now, what has happened over time is that some of the poor countries have fallen into debt traps, and because of which they are forced to borrow large sums of money from the International Monetary Fund. And whenever the International Monetary Fund lends money to other countries, what we have noticed is that they have imposed conditionalities that their economy should be, in fact, reoriented in a certain fashion so that their loan is repaid. Now, what has happened over a period of time is that when there have been budgetary cuts due to these conditionalities imposed by IMF, the the outlay for environmental protection in many countries has also gone down drastically. And due to this, there has been a lot of problem, and these problems have, in fact, created major issues in many developing countries as well. Now, if you look at the World Bank, it was in fact created to finance the reconstruction of the post Second World War Europe. Now, the World Bank is a combination of two institutions. One is the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and the second one is the International Development Agency. Now, the IBRD, or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, gives assistance and loans to middle income countries. And the International Development Agency, it gives interest-free loans to various least developed countries. Now, the World Bank Group also has institutions such as the International Finance Corporation, Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, etc., etc. Now, the International Monetary Fund has three major objectives. One is to promote international monetary cooperation. Second one is to facilitate expansion of international trade. And the third one is to promote exchange rate stability. And for achieving this, it imposes what is known as the Structural Adjustment Program, which is basically nothing but an effort to improve the investment climate in a particular country through promotion of exports and to reduce the budget deficits of governments. So the structural adjustment program has been heavily criticized because when it is imposed on developing countries, there is an increase in poverty. There is major difficulties in those countries. Health, education, environment, everything. The outlay for health, education, environment, everything is reduced, and therefore the structural adjustment programs are often criticized greatly. However, the World Bank has also worked in the field of environmental protection. What it does is that nowadays it is addressing potentially adverse environmental impact of World Bank financed environmental projects. It insists that those projects which are financed by it, it should not be environmentally adverse. Then it is also helping countries to promote environmental protection. It is also helping to implement environmental sound policies. It is also promoting global environmental participation through the Global Environmental Facility, which we have talked about earlier. And the World Bank also makes it mandatory for all borrowers to perform environmental impact assessment before going in for any project. Environment impact assessment basically looks into what is the impact of a project on the environment. And World Bank makes it mandatory for all borrowers to, first of all, go in for environmental impact assessment. Now, trade and environment has a kind of trade-off. You cannot have both at all the times. So, if you place too much of emphasis on trade, then definitely there will be more polluting industries. And because when you set up industries and such other things for increasing products for trade, it means that it will be polluting the environment, and as a result of this pollution, you will find that the environment is affected. And if you emphasize more on environment, then trade and other economic activities will suffer greatly. So it is our duty to find a balance between environmental protection and trade. Therefore, all countries have to successfully achieve this balance. Then only we can have sustainable development. And it is not a very effective mechanism to, in fact, impose trade sanctions on polluting countries, because when you impose trade sanctions, all products are affected by trade sanctions, and as a result of that, even those industries which do not pollute the environment, their products will also be affected in this process. So this is in a nutshell what I had to discuss today. If you have any doubts or anything to be clarified, you can definitely ask me now. Okay, if you do not have any doubt or anything to be discussed, we'll close the session today. So thank you for attending the session, and we will meet next week. Arya, fine?
Okay, sir, fine.
Any doubt or any clarification?
No.
Thank you. Thank you so much, and we'll
Yes,
meet
sir.
next week. Thank you so much.
Okay, sir.